Harlem, New York. It was Monday evening, January 13, 1969, approximately 9:47 p.m., when Frank Lucas stepped out of Small's Paradise on 7th Avenue and 135th Street, wearing a custom-made cashmere coat that had cost him more than most working families in Harlem earned in 6 months, a charcoal gray suit from his Italian tailor on the Lower East Side, and shoes made from leather so fine they'd been hand-selected from a tannery in Milan. Lucas had just finished a dinner meeting with 3 of his most trusted distributors, men who moved his blue magic heroin through networks that stretched from Harlem to Philadelphia to Detroit, and he was heading toward his Cadillac Eldorado parked 2 blocks away on Lenox Avenue, walking through the cold January night with the confidence of a man who owned these streets in ways that had nothing to do with property deeds or legal ownership, but everything to do with power and money and the respect that came from building an empire that the traditional Italian mob families were just beginning to understand they couldn't control. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that most people hurried from building to building rather than lingering on street corners, cold enough that the usual crowds that filled Harlem's sidewalks had thinned to occasional pedestrians moving quickly toward their destinations. Lucas walked at his characteristic unhurried pace, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes constantly scanning the street the way a man who'd survived Harlem's underworld for 2 decades learned to scan, always watching for threats, always calculating distances to cover if something went wrong, always aware of who was behind him and who was ahead of him, and which direction offered the fastest escape route if escape became necessary. Lucas was 48 years old in January 1969. And he'd spent the previous 4 years building what would become the most profitable heroin operation in New York City's history. He'd eliminated the Italian middlemen who traditionally controlled drug distribution, had established direct connections to suppliers in Southeast Asia through contacts he'd made with U.S. military personnel stationed in Vietnam, and had created a distribution network that moved product faster and more efficiently than any organization the New York Police Department had encountered before. Lucas was making approximately $1 million per day in January 1969, cash money that flowed through his operation in quantities that required entire rooms just to count and process it, wealth that had transformed him from a North Carolina farm boy who'd arrived in Harlem with nothing into one of the most powerful criminals in New York. But wealth and power created problems that poor people never experienced. The more successful Lucas became, the more attention he attracted from law enforcement, from rival criminals, from corrupt officials who wanted their share of his profits, and from racist cops who resented seeing a black man driving expensive cars and wearing expensive clothes and acting like he owned Harlem, when cops like them believed black people should remain subordinate and grateful for whatever crumbs white society allowed them to have. As Lucas approached the corner of 135th Street and Lenox Avenue, he noticed a police patrol car parked against the curb approximately 30 yards ahead, its engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air, 2 officers sitting in the front seat watching the street. Lucas recognized the car immediately because he made it his business to know which cops worked which precincts and which ones were on his payroll and which ones were problems that needed to be managed carefully. The patrol car belonged to the 32nd Precinct, and the officer behind the wheel was Detective Dennis O'Sullivan, a 15-year veteran of the NYPD who had a reputation throughout Harlem as one of the most viciously racist cops in a police department that had plenty of competition for that particular distinction. O'Sullivan was Irish-American, 42 years old, built like a linebacker with shoulders that strained against his uniform jacket and hands that looked like they'd broken plenty of faces during his years on the force. He'd grown up in Hell's Kitchen back when it was still an Irish neighborhood, had joined the police department in 1954, and had spent his entire career nursing resentments about how the city was changing, how neighborhoods that had been white were becoming black and Puerto Rican, how criminals who should have been easy to control because they were colored, and therefore naturally inferior, were somehow making millions of dollars and driving better cars than honest white cops could afford on their salaries. O'Sullivan had a particular hatred for Frank Lucas, not because Lucas had ever done anything specifically to O'Sullivan personally, but because Lucas represented everything O'Sullivan despised about the way New York was changing. Here was a colored man, a drug dealer, a criminal, who dressed better than O'Sullivan did, who drove a car that cost more than O'Sullivan would earn in 5 years, who walked through Harlem like he owned it, and who couldn't be intimidated or controlled the way colored criminals were supposed to be intimidated and controlled by white police authority. O'Sullivan had tried multiple times to arrest Lucas on various charges, but Lucas had expensive lawyers who made cases disappear, had paid informants who warned him about investigations before they could gather evidence, and had enough money to bribe the right officials to ensure that even when he was arrested, charges were reduced or dismissed before they reached trial. Every time O'Sullivan failed to make charges stick against Lucas, it fed his rage, confirmed his belief that the system was broken, that political correctness and liberal judges were making it impossible for good cops to do their jobs, that men like Frank Lucas were being protected by a system that cared more about avoiding accusations of racism than about enforcing the law. As Lucas walked past the patrol car, O'Sullivan opened the driver's side door and stepped out onto the sidewalk, deliberately positioning himself in Lucas's path. The other officer, a younger man named Rodriguez who'd been partnered with O'Sullivan for only 6 weeks, and who'd already learned that O'Sullivan's methods created problems that Rodriguez wanted no part of, remained in the passenger seat, watching through the windshield, but not participating in whatever O'Sullivan was about to do. "Hold it right there, Frank," O'Sullivan said, his voice carrying across the empty sidewalk with that particular tone of command that cops learned to use, that assumption that their authority gave them the right to stop anyone they wanted and demand anything they wanted and expect immediate compliance. Lucas stopped walking but didn't change his expression, didn't show anger or fear or even curiosity, just looked at O'Sullivan with the flat, measuring gaze of a man who'd dealt with cops like this his entire adult life, and who'd learned that showing emotion only encouraged them. "Evening, Detective O'Sullivan," Lucas said, his voice quiet and controlled, giving nothing away. "Something I can help you with?" O'Sullivan stepped closer, invading Lucas's personal space in the way cops did when they wanted to establish dominance, when they wanted to make clear that they had the power to touch you or search you or arrest you whenever they felt like it, and that your expensive clothes and expensive car didn't mean anything, when a cop decided to remind you of your place in society's hierarchy. "Where are you coming from, Frank?" O'Sullivan asked, even though he obviously knew Lucas had been at Small's Paradise because O'Sullivan had probably been watching the restaurant, had probably been waiting for Lucas to come out. "Had dinner with some friends?" Lucas replied, still keeping his voice neutral, not giving O'Sullivan anything to react to, not playing whatever game O'Sullivan wanted to play. "Just heading home now. Cold night to be standing around talking." O'Sullivan smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Was instead the kind of expression that suggested he was enjoying himself, enjoying the opportunity to hassle Frank Lucas on a public street, enjoying the power differential that his badge and gun created, even though Lucas probably had more actual power in Harlem than O'Sullivan would ever have. "You know what I think, Frank?" O'Sullivan said, his voice getting louder now, carrying across the street to the few pedestrians who were hurrying past, making sure they could hear what he was saying. "I think you're getting too comfortable. I think you've forgotten that you're just a colored drug dealer who's going to end up dead or in prison like every other colored drug dealer I've ever known. I think you're walking around Harlem in your fancy clothes acting like you're somebody important, when the truth is you're just another criminal who's going to get what's coming to him eventually." Lucas felt anger rising in his chest, that familiar hot feeling that he'd learned to control decades ago, because losing your temper with cops was the fastest way to end up beaten or arrested or both, was exactly what cops like O'Sullivan wanted because it gave them justification to use force, to turn a street conversation into an arrest for resisting or assaulting an officer. Lucas took a slow breath, let the anger settle, and responded in the same quiet voice he'd been using. "Detective, I haven't broken any laws tonight. I had dinner at a restaurant and now I'm walking to my car. If you want to arrest me for something, then arrest me and I'll call my lawyer. If you don't want to arrest me, then I'm going to continue walking to my car because it's 18 degrees out here and I'd like to go home to my family." O'Sullivan's expression hardened, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You think your lawyer makes you untouchable? You think your money protects you? Let me tell you something, Frank. I've been a cop for 15 years, and I've seen plenty of colored boys who thought they were smart, thought they were special, thought they could get away with dealing drugs in my city. And you know where every single one of them ended up? Either dead in an alley or serving life sentences upstate. That's your future, Frank. The only question is whether you end up dead or in prison, but either way you're going down." Then O'Sullivan leaned even closer, his face inches from Lucas's face, his breath visible in the cold air, and said something that would seal his fate, though he didn't know it at the time. And when it happens, when you end up bleeding out in some alley or sitting in a cell upstate, I'm gonna smile, Frank. I'm gonna remember this moment and smile because I'll know that another uppity-colored criminal finally got what he deserved. I'm gonna make it my personal mission to see you destroyed, Frank. One way or another, you're not gonna survive 1969. The threat was explicit and personal, went beyond the usual cop harassment that Lucas dealt with regularly, crossed a line from professional antagonism into something that sounded like a promise of violence. Lucas held O'Sullivan's gaze for 3 seconds, long enough that O'Sullivan's expression shifted slightly, some small part of his brain recognizing that maybe he'd gone too far, that maybe threatening Frank Lucas explicitly on a public street wasn't the smartest move he'd ever made. Then Lucas nodded once, a gesture that could have meant acknowledgement or could have meant something else entirely, stepped around O'Sullivan and continued walking toward his Cadillac. Behind him, he heard O'Sullivan laugh, heard him say something to Rodriguez about uppity coloreds knowing their place. But Lucas didn't turn around, didn't respond, just walked to his car with the same unhurried pace he'd maintained throughout the conversation, climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. But as Lucas drove through Harlem streets toward his home in Teaneck, New Jersey, he was thinking about O'Sullivan's threat, analyzing it the way a businessman analyzes a competitive threat, considering the implications and the potential responses. Lucas had dealt with racist cops his entire career, had learned to navigate their hostility through a combination of bribing the ones who could be bribed, avoiding the ones who couldn't, and occasionally using violence against the ones who posed serious enough threats that violence became necessary for self-preservation. But O'Sullivan was different from most racist cops because O'Sullivan couldn't be bribed. Lucas had already tried that approach, had already had intermediaries reach out to O'Sullivan with offers of money in exchange for O'Sullivan looking the other way, and O'Sullivan had refused every offer, not because O'Sullivan was particularly honest or moral, but because O'Sullivan's hatred of Lucas was personal and ideological, was about maintaining white supremacy and punishing successful black criminals who challenged the racial hierarchy that O'Sullivan believed in, and money couldn't buy off that kind of hatred. And O'Sullivan posed a genuine threat because he had the resources and authority of the NYPD behind him, had the power to make Lucas's life difficult in ways that regular criminals couldn't, had the ability to arrest Lucas on pretextual charges and make those charges stick long enough to disrupt Lucas's operations, even if the charges eventually got dismissed. More importantly, O'Sullivan's explicit threat about Lucas not surviving 1969 suggested he might be planning something beyond routine police harassment, might be planning to arrange Lucas's death either directly or through proxies, and that kind of threat required a response that would neutralize the danger permanently. Lucas drove across the George Washington Bridge thinking about the problem of Dennis O'Sullivan, and by the time he reached his home in Teaneck, he'd concluded that O'Sullivan had to be dealt with decisively, not out of revenge or wounded pride, but out of practical necessity. A cop who'd made an explicit threat against your life was a cop who would eventually try to follow through on that threat, and waiting for O'Sullivan to make his move was letting O'Sullivan control the timing and circumstances of whatever was coming. Better to act first, to remove the threat before it materialized into something that couldn't be controlled. But killing a cop was complicated in ways that killing regular criminals wasn't. Cops had resources, had colleagues who would investigate thoroughly, had unions that would demand justice, had a system that treated cop killings differently from any other kind of murder. If Lucas ordered O'Sullivan killed in an obvious way, the NYPD would come after Lucas and everyone associated with him with a level of intensity that would destroy his operation, regardless of whether they could prove Lucas ordered the hit. So whatever happened to O'Sullivan had to look like something other than a deliberate hit, had to be deniable, had to be the kind of thing where people might suspect Lucas was involved but couldn't prove anything, and where even the suspicion wouldn't necessarily trigger the full weight of law enforcement retaliation, because the circumstances would be ambiguous enough that the NYPD couldn't be certain Lucas was responsible. Lucas made 3 phone calls that evening from his home in Teaneck, using a phone he kept specifically for sensitive conversations, a line that wasn't tapped because Lucas paid telephone company employees to alert him if law enforcement requested wiretaps. The first call was to Red Turner, his most trusted enforcer, a man who'd worked for Lucas since 1966 and who'd handled multiple situations that required violence or intimidation. The second call was to Doc Perkins, a physician who'd lost his medical license after being convicted of illegal prescription drug distribution, but who still maintained connections throughout New York's medical community and who'd done various favors for Lucas over the years in exchange for money and protection. The third call was to Jimmy Z, a corrupt cop in the 32nd Precinct who'd been on Lucas's payroll for 3 years and who provided inside information about NYPD investigations and personnel. By midnight, Lucas had assembled these 3 men in the basement of a house he owned on 147th Street in Harlem, a property that was registered under a front company's name, and that Lucas used for meetings he wanted to keep completely private. The basement had been soundproofed and furnished comfortably, with leather chairs and a conference table and a full bar, looking more like a corporate executive's private office than a drug dealer's meeting room. Lucas sat at the head of the table and explained the situation, speaking in his characteristic quiet voice that made people lean forward to listen. Earlier tonight, Detective Dennis O'Sullivan stopped me on Lenox Avenue and made an explicit threat against my life. Said he was going to make it his personal mission to see me destroyed, said I wouldn't survive 1969. The threat was specific and personal, and O'Sullivan has the resources and the motivation to potentially follow through. Red Turner, who was built like a heavyweight boxer, and who'd earned his nickname from his reddish hair rather than any political affiliation, leaned back in his chair and said what everyone in the room was thinking. You want him hit. I can make it happen. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong or a domestic situation. Cops die all the time in this city. But Lucas shook his head. Too obvious. If O'Sullivan gets killed and it looks like a deliberate hit, the NYPD will investigate thoroughly, and they'll focus on me because everyone knows O'Sullivan and I have had problems. Even if they can't prove I ordered it, the investigation will disrupt our operations, will cost money and time, and will create heat we don't need. We need something that doesn't look like a hit, something that looks accidental or natural, something where people might suspect I was involved but can't prove anything, and where the circumstances are ambiguous enough that the NYPD can't justify coming after me with full intensity. Doc Perkins, who was 63 years old, and who still carried himself with the professional demeanor he'd cultivated during his years as a licensed physician, leaned forward and spoke carefully. Are you asking me what I think you're asking me? Because if you are, we need to be very clear about what we're discussing here. Lucas looked at Perkins directly. I'm asking if there are methods that could cause a person to have what appears to be a natural death, something that wouldn't necessarily trigger an autopsy or intensive investigation, something that could look like a heart attack or stroke or some other medical event that happens to middle-aged men who work stressful jobs and who probably don't take care of their health as well as they should. Perkins was quiet for a moment, considering the implications, considering the risk of what Lucas was asking, considering the money that would make that risk worthwhile. There are certain substances that can induce cardiac events or strokes, substances that metabolize quickly and don't leave obvious traces in routine toxicology screening. The technical challenges aren't insurmountable. The real challenges are administration. You'd need access to the target in circumstances where you could introduce the substance without being observed, and plausibility. The event has to occur in a context where natural death seems reasonable rather than suspicious. Jimmy Z, who was 38 years old and who'd been a cop for 12 years before Lucas had successfully bribed him, pulled out a small notebook and flipped through pages of handwritten notes. O'Sullivan works the 4 to midnight shift most weeks. Lives in Queens, married, 2 kids, drives a 1966 Ford Galaxy. He usually stops at a bar called Mulligan's on Queens Boulevard after his shift, drinks for an hour or 2, then drives home. Sometimes he works overtime on weekends doing security for construction sites. He's got high blood pressure according to his personnel file. I accessed it last year when you first asked me to compile information on him. And he's overweight and smokes heavily and probably drinks too much based on how often he's at Mulligan's. Lucas listened to this information, processing it, building a plan that would use O'Sullivan's own habits and health problems against him. So we have a middle-aged cop with high blood pressure who smokes and drinks regularly. If he had a heart attack or stroke, it wouldn't necessarily seem suspicious given his risk factors. The question is how we create the medical event in circumstances that don't point back to us. What followed was 90 minutes of detailed planning, as Lucas and the 3 others developed a strategy that combined medical knowledge, inside police information, and careful timing to create what would appear to be a tragic but unsuspicious death. The plan had several components that would be implemented over the following 2 weeks. First, Doc Perkins would acquire the necessary substances, specific cardiac glycosides that could induce heart arrhythmias when administered in concentrated doses, substances that occurred naturally in certain plants and that would metabolize within hours, leaving minimal traces that routine toxicology screening might miss entirely. Perkins had connections to pharmaceutical suppliers and to underground chemists who could provide these substances without asking questions or creating paper trails. Second, Jimmy Z would monitor O'Sullivan's schedule and habits, identifying the optimal time and place for the plan to be executed. The goal was to find circumstances where O'Sullivan would be alone, or with minimal witnesses, where his death could occur without immediate medical intervention, and where the surrounding context would support the narrative of natural causes rather than foul play. Third, Red Turner would handle the actual administration of the substances, using methods that wouldn't leave physical evidence or attract attention. The plan avoided anything that looked like an attack or forced ingestion, instead focusing on more subtle approaches that would deliver the substance without O'Sullivan being aware he'd been dosed. And fourth, Lucas himself would ensure he had a solid alibi for whenever the plan was executed, being visible in public settings with multiple witnesses who could confirm his whereabouts, making it impossible for investigators to place him anywhere near O'Sullivan when the death occurred. The plan was implemented starting January 20th, 1969, when Jimmy Z confirmed that O'Sullivan would be working security at a construction site in the Bronx on Saturday, January 25th, a 12-hour shift from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. that O'Sullivan had worked before, guarding equipment and materials from thieves. The construction site was in a relatively isolated area, and O'Sullivan would be alone for most of the shift, sitting in a trailer with a space heater, drinking coffee from a thermos he brought from home, and smoking cigarettes to pass the time. On Friday evening, January 24th, Red Turner broke into O'Sullivan's Ford Galaxy while it was parked outside Mulligan's bar where O'Sullivan was drinking after his shift. The break-in took less than 2 minutes, was accomplished without triggering any alarms or attracting any attention, and gave Turner access to O'Sullivan's thermos, which was sitting on the passenger seat where O'Sullivan left it between shifts. Turner carefully opened the thermos, used a syringe to inject a carefully measured dose of the cardiac glycoside that Doc Perkins had prepared into the coffee that was already in the thermos, closed the thermos, and left the car exactly as he'd found it. The entire operation took less than 5 minutes, was conducted on a dark street with no witnesses, and left no physical evidence that anyone had accessed the vehicle. Saturday morning, January 25th, O'Sullivan drove to the construction site in the Bronx, parked his Galaxy near the trailer that served as the security office, and began his shift. According to the reconstruction that police would later develop based on the evidence they found, O'Sullivan spent the morning sitting in the trailer, drinking coffee from his thermos, smoking cigarettes, and periodically walking around the construction site to check that nothing was being disturbed. The construction site was empty on Saturday. No workers present, just O'Sullivan alone guarding equipment that probably wasn't valuable enough to justify the cost of security, but that the construction company insured anyway, because insurance companies required it. Around 1:30 p.m., approximately 5 hours after O'Sullivan had started drinking the coffee from his thermos, he began experiencing symptoms of cardiac distress. The cardiac glycoside that Doc Perkins had selected was designed to induce ventricular arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats that could rapidly progress to cardiac arrest, especially in someone with O'Sullivan's pre-existing cardiovascular risk factors. O'Sullivan probably felt chest pain first, then shortness of breath, then irregular heartbeat, then the crushing sensation of his heart failing to pump blood effectively. O'Sullivan managed to call for help using the radio in the trailer, transmitted a garbled message about chest pain and needing an ambulance. But by the time EMS arrived at the construction site approximately 18 minutes later, O'Sullivan was unconscious and had no pulse. The paramedics attempted resuscitation, transported O'Sullivan to Bronx Municipal Hospital, and continued attempting to restart his heart for another 40 minutes. But O'Sullivan was pronounced dead at 3:17 p.m. on January 25, 1969. Approximately 6 hours after he'd consumed the coffee that had been laced with the substance that killed him. The death was initially treated as a tragic but unsurprising event. Middle-aged cop with high blood pressure and multiple cardiovascular risk factors dies of apparent heart attack while working overtime security shift. The hospital documented cause of death as acute myocardial infarction, heart attack, which fit the symptoms in O'Sullivan's medical history. The NYPD conducted a routine investigation, confirmed that O'Sullivan had been alone at the construction site and that there was no evidence of foul play, interviewed his family, and confirmed that he'd been complaining about stress and chest pains in recent weeks, and concluded that O'Sullivan had died of natural causes related to his underlying health problems. There was no autopsy because New York City medical examiners didn't routinely perform autopsies on deaths that appeared natural and that occurred in circumstances that didn't suggest criminal activity. O'Sullivan's family didn't request an autopsy because they accepted the hospital's explanation that he died of a heart attack, and they wanted to proceed with funeral arrangements quickly, according to Catholic tradition. The NYPD gave O'Sullivan a full inspector's funeral. Hundreds of cops attended to honor their fallen colleague, and within 2 weeks, Dennis O'Sullivan was buried, and the investigation into his death was closed. Frank Lucas attended O'Sullivan's funeral. Not the church service, which would have been inappropriate given the antagonism between them, but the burial at Calvary Cemetery in Queens, where Lucas stood at a distance of approximately 50 yards from the gravesite, visible enough that any cops who noticed him would know he'd come, but far enough away that his presence couldn't be interpreted as disrespectful or provocative. Lucas wore a black suit and stood quietly while O'Sullivan's coffin was lowered into the ground, stood while O'Sullivan's widow and children grieved, stood while the NYPD honor guard fired their salute, and stood while the crowd dispersed. Several cops noticed Lucas standing there and glared at him, clearly angry that the man O'Sullivan had been targeting would dare show up at his funeral, but none of them approached Lucas or said anything because what would they say? What evidence did they have that Lucas had anything to do with O'Sullivan's death? O'Sullivan had died of a heart attack while working alone at a construction site. There was no indication of foul play, no signs of violence, no evidence of poisoning in the routine tests the hospital had conducted. If cops wanted to suspect Lucas was somehow responsible, they were welcome to suspect, but suspicion without evidence was just another frustration they'd have to live with. Lucas stood at the cemetery for approximately 15 minutes after the funeral ended, long enough to be noticed, long enough to make whatever statement he was making, then walked back to his Cadillac and drove away. He never spoke publicly about O'Sullivan's death, never confirmed or denied any involvement, never explained why he'd attended the funeral. The message his presence sent was clear to everyone who understood how power worked in Harlem. Detective Dennis O'Sullivan had threatened Frank Lucas publicly on a January evening, had said Lucas wouldn't survive 1969, and then O'Sullivan had died 6 weeks later while Lucas continued operating his business successfully and building his empire, and proving that threats worked both directions, that cops who made personal vendettas against powerful criminals might discover that power didn't flow exclusively from badges and guns, but also came from money and connections and willingness to use methods that couldn't be proven or defended against. The story of O'Sullivan's death became legend in Harlem, became one of those stories that people told in whispers and that illustrated the kind of power Frank Lucas wielded during his peak years. No one could prove Lucas had anything to do with it. No evidence ever emerged that connected Lucas to O'Sullivan's heart attack, but the timing was too perfect, the circumstances too convenient, and Lucas's reputation too well established for people to believe the death was merely coincidental. Whether Lucas actually ordered O'Sullivan's death or whether O'Sullivan genuinely died of natural causes related to his health problems became irrelevant compared to what people believed had happened, and what people believed was that Frank Lucas had responded to a racist cop's threat by arranging that cop's death in a way that couldn't be proven or punished. And that belief, regardless of whether it was factually accurate, served Lucas's interests perfectly. It demonstrated to other cops that targeting Lucas personally carried risks that went beyond normal criminal police antagonism. It demonstrated to rivals and competitors that Lucas had resources and methods that extended into areas most criminals couldn't access. It demonstrated to his own organization that Lucas protected his people and himself with a level of strategic sophistication that justified their loyalty and their trust. Whether O'Sullivan's death was murder or tragedy or some combination of both, the result was the same. One of Frank Lucas's most persistent and dangerous enemies had been removed, and Lucas had emerged from the situation stronger and more untouchable than before. Detective Dennis O'Sullivan, who'd told Frank Lucas on that January evening that Lucas wouldn't survive 1969, had himself not survived the winter, had died on a cold Saturday afternoon in the Bronx in circumstances that appeared natural, but that people throughout Harlem understood were anything but accidental. The racist cop who'd threatened Frank Lucas had learned too late that threats were dangerous things to make against men who had the resources and the ruthlessness to turn those threats around, to transform them into boomerangs that came back with lethal force against the people who'd made them. Frank Lucas survived 1969 and continued operating his empire for another 6 years before federal investigators finally built a case strong enough to convict him in 1975. But in January 1969, when Dennis O'Sullivan had threatened him on a Harlem street, Lucas had demonstrated the same lesson he'd learned from Bumpy Johnson decades earlier, that power wasn't always about immediate retaliation or obvious violence, but could be about patience and strategy and applying force in ways that looked like something other than force, that couldn't be proven or defended against, that left your enemies dead or destroyed while you continued operating as if nothing had happened. Detective Dennis O'Sullivan, who'd believed his badge and his gun and his whiteness made him untouchable, who'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating a black criminal he considered inherently inferior, had ended up in Calvary Cemetery while Frank Lucas had attended his funeral, and then driven away in his Cadillac to continue building his empire. The racist cop who'd threatened Frank Lucas hadn't survived the winter, and whether that was murder or poetic justice or simple karma, the result was the same. Another man who'd challenged Frank Lucas had lost, had paid for that challenge with his life, and had become another story that people told about why you didn't threaten Frank Lucas unless you were prepared for the possibility that the threat might be the last mistake you ever made.